The silence in the closed-door meeting of the House Leadership Caucus was sharper and far more dangerous than any Senate hearing. Governor Gavin Newsom sat rigid, realizing too late that his scheduled coronation had devolved into an inquisition. His inquisitor was not an enemy Republican, but Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, whose unfiltered, direct style was now turned against the man who represented the party's establishment future. Crockett lifted the transcript of the Ezra Klein interview, a document that felt less like an interview and more like a detailed self-incrimination. "Governor Newsom," Crockett began, her voice holding the distinct, cutting authority that had made her a viral political force. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries. You told the American public that the Democratic failure on the border was because the entire strategy was driven by vengeance, moving 180 degrees in the opposite direction from the previous administration. You admitted the why was everything was in reaction to Trump." Crockett allowed the damaging words to echo, 180 degrees in the opposite direction, highlighting the political idiocy. "Sir, we have spent 4 years battling the narrative that we are soft on border security. A narrative that has crippled our ability to pass comprehensive reform. And you, the man running for president, openly confessed that the chaos wasn't an accident of policy, but a deliberate, vindictive choice to dismantle enforcement out of spite." Newsom, ready to defend his pragmatism, was faced with an assault on his ideological loyalty. Was the perceived failure of the Democratic Party, Crockett demanded, leaning in until her voice was a direct, dangerous whisper, truly worth the price of validating Donald Trump? Because when you concede that we failed, Governor, you hand the opposition the weapon they need to destroy our entire bench. The confrontation had immediately established that Newsom's honesty was viewed as a catastrophic act of ideological betrayal by his own party. Representative Jasmine Crockett immediately escalated the attack, linking Newsom's ideological betrayal to the financial hypocrisy revealed by his policies. She focused on how Newsom's attempt to be a pragmatist directly undercut the economic and political messaging of the progressive wing. "Let's talk about the money you spent, Governor, and whose pocket it came out of," Crockett commanded, her tone transitioning from political fury to fiscal skepticism. She displayed the chart detailing California's expanded Medi-Cal coverage, specifically the portion funded by the federal government. Crockett acknowledged Newsom's pride in universal healthcare, even for undocumented residents. "You stand on the moral high ground claiming you believe in universal healthcare," Crockett stated, her voice dripping with skepticism. "But the minute you say you are proud to do this in California, you are validating the Trump narrative that we want to use national taxpayer money for this policy. Your own state's documents show more than half of that funding comes from the federal treasury." Crockett pressed on the damaging contradiction. "The moment you admit that, Governor, you strip us of our entire defense. We are fighting a desperate campaign against the charge that we want to redistribute national wealth to undocumented migrants. And you publicly confirm that your model, the supposed gold standard, is financially dependent on the federal money of Arkansas and Texas." Newsom attempted to defend the policy as a necessary pragmatic measure to avoid costly emergency room visits, a defense he had used publicly. Crockett swatted the defense away with a sharp wave of her hand. "Pragmatism is when you achieve a goal without giving the enemy their talking points. You achieved your goal, but you provided the opposition with the receipts. You admitted the 180-degree failure and then confirmed the federal subsidy. You gave them the security failure and the financial hypocrisy. That is not pragmatism, Governor. That is political malpractice." She concluded the segment by focusing on the immediate damage to the party. "Your admission that we failed on the border forced every member of this caucus to immediately defend a position we spent years denying was true. You provided the single most potent soundbite for the opposition's campaign ads. We need to know, Governor, are you running to lead this party, or are you running to destroy it for the sake of an Ezra Klein profile?" The atmosphere was one of internal collapse, proving that sometimes The most dangerous enemy is the man who chooses to be honest at the expense of his own comrades. Representative Jasmine Crockett immediately followed her fiscal assault by targeting the profound strategic hypocrisy of Newsom's border analysis. Her focus shifted from the past to the present, highlighting how Newsom's attempt to sound reasonable had utterly validated the core arguments of the opposition's champion, Donald Trump. Governor Crockett continued, her posture aggressive, refusing to yield the floor to the caucus chair. You praised the Biden administration's actions in the last 6 months, the use of executive authority to significantly curb border crossings, as the necessary move that finally stemmed the tide. You then stated that in doing so, President Biden actually proved Trump right. I want you to elaborate on the political calculus of that concession. Crockett demanded to know why Newsom felt compelled to cede victory to the opposition's core ideological premise. The border crisis, she insisted, was a humanitarian and economic challenge that required progressive solutions, not an opportunity to praise the effectiveness of the opposition's strong-arm tactics. When you say the president proved Trump right, you are validating the entire premise of the Republican Party. Crockett charged, you are conceding that executive power, used unilaterally to restrict immigration, is the only effective solution. That admission damages every single candidate running on a platform of humane, comprehensive reform. It signals to the electorate that our entire legislative agenda is based on fantasy. Newsom attempted to defend his statement as merely an observation of political reality, that the administration, backed into a corner by congressional inaction, had no choice but to use the tools at hand. Crockett dismissed the defense as strategic cowardice. Reality, Governor, is what you articulate to the public, and you chose to articulate the opposition's reality. The failure wasn't just in the policy, it was in the messaging. For years, we fought the narrative that Trump's policies were effective. You just handed the opposition the ultimate political gift, the admission that the enemy's methods were the only ones that worked. She then linked the admission back to the initial, disastrous failure. Newsom's analysis suggested that the political spite, the 180 degrees in the opposite direction pivot, was the cause of the crisis. Crockett argued that this spite had metastasized into self-sabotage. You admitted the Biden administration was paralyzed by the notion that they couldn't act without Congress. But then they acted anyway, and the crossings declined. Crockett asserted, the ultimate price we paid was not just the chaos at the border, but the wrong lessons learned in the midterms. You acknowledged that the party ignored the border issue because of unexpected local victories. That strategic neglect, validated by your current confession, tells the public we are more concerned with political optics than with national security. The environment in the caucus room was one of growing hostility, fueled by the realization that their potential champion, in a quest for perceived pragmatism, had provided the opposition with the complete tactical playbook. Newsom's attempt to appear reasonable had resulted in the greatest ideological surrender of the 2028 cycle, confirming that the Democratic failure was indeed a self-inflicted wound rooted in political vengeance and strategic denial. Representative Jasmine Crockett relentlessly hammered the financial and ethical hypocrisy of California's universal healthcare policy, stripping away Governor Gavin Newsom's defense of moral imperative by focusing on the defrauded national taxpayer. Her objective was to establish that Newsom's signature policy was not a model of progressive governance but a financially parasitic operation. Governor, let's dissect your moral victory with a dose of fiscal reality, Crockett demanded, her voice cutting through the tension. You stated that extending healthcare to undocumented immigrants was a necessary action to keep people out of the emergency room, claiming Americans would pay for it, one way or another. That implies California is bearing the full burden of its compassionate ideals. Crockett brought forward the detailed analysis that had already caused discomfort in the caucus, the nonpartisan fiscal review confirming that the colossal Medi-Cal budget, despite Newsom's state-level pride, was reliant on federal funds. Your own documents confirm that more than half of the nearly $200 billion budget is funded by the federal government. Governor, you are not operating a unilateral moral imperative. You are running a massive, federally subsidized sanctuary program. Why should the working families of my district in Texas, or in rural Ohio, fund your political aesthetic in Sacramento? The intensity of the internal critique was crushing. Crockett was not arguing policy. She was arguing financial betrayal. Newsom's claim that Democrats were not trying to extend federal benefits to illegal immigrants had been publicly, demonstrably proven false by his own state's budgetary structure. You admitted that the political strategy failed because we moved 180 degrees in reaction to Trump, Crockett asserted, connecting the ideological error to the financial deception. The ultimate hypocrisy is this: you move 180 degrees to dismantle border security, causing mass migration, and then you force the federal government, the same government you claim is dysfunctional, to pay the bill for the consequence of your own state's sanctuary laws and your party's strategic spite. Newsom attempted to regain control by citing the necessity of treating all residents humanely, regardless of status, and reiterating the emergency room cost argument. Crockett preempted the defense with the final, damning piece of evidence from the analysis. Your policy is not just about emergency rooms, it's about comprehensive, gold-plated care, all subsidized by the American taxpayer. You deliberately passed an unfunded mandate onto the nation, all while knowing that your actions created the conditions for the mass migration that required the funding in the first place. She concluded with a summary designed to be replayed in every primary debate. Governor, you are the frontrunner of our party, yet you validated the opposition's security premise and confirmed their financial accusation. You have presented yourself as a leader whose first instinct is ideological revenge, followed by financial dependency on the very system you claim to be morally superior to. That is not a winning formula, sir. That is the definition of political malpractice. The caucus room understood the gravity. Newsom had made himself the ultimate liability. Representative Jasmine Crockett shifted the focus from security and finance to the cultural battlefield, pinpointing how Governor Gavin Newsom's extreme ideological posturing alienated the vast majority of the electorate, compounding the damage done by his border confession. Crockett's strategy was to demonstrate that Newsom's political DNA was fatally contradictory, making him untenable in a general election. Governor, let's discuss the second, equally damaging contradiction you presented to the American public, Crockett demanded, her voice now expressing frustration rather than mere hostility. On the one hand, you admit that on the issue of border security, we must be pragmatic and own up to the failure. On the other hand, you proudly embrace a position on cultural issues that you yourself admitted 80% of the public rejects. She referenced Newsom's highly personal and visible advocacy for pro-trans legislation, specifically the unnerving statement that he wants to see trans kids, linking his passion to his personal relationship with his trans godson. You tell us you govern with your heart, not just your head, and that this position was not a political evolution. Crockett asserted, that is precisely the problem. Governor, you prioritize a deeply personal, emotionally driven position that is a proven losing issue for the Democratic Party, while admitting that you failed to govern effectively on a core national security issue that affects everyone. Crockett argued that this was not merely bad politics, it was a fundamental misreading of the political landscape. You have created a candidate profile that is anathema to the American center, a figure who is incompetent on security but radical on culture. You chose to fight the culture war on the enemy's most favorable ground, confirming their narrative that the Democratic Party is out of touch, focusing on niche, polarizing issues while the country falls apart. She pointed out the stark irony. Newsom was running on a platform of governing California successfully, yet his own words suggested a radical detachment from the electorate's priorities. The opposition, the Trump machine and its nominees like J.D. Vance, did not have to lie. They simply had to play back Newsom's confession of ideological extremism. You are the strongest advocate for pro-trans legislation. Yet you acknowledge nobody wants to hear about it. Crockett pressed. Why should this caucus rally behind a candidate who actively pursues policies that he knows guarantee an 80% disapproval rate? That is not leadership. That is political self-immolation dressed up as moral courage. The consequence of this cultural extremism was obvious. It ensured that the moderate and independent voters, already alienated by the border failure, would never return to the Democratic fold. Newsom, through his own boasting, had guaranteed that the opposition would successfully frame the 2028 election not as a debate over infrastructure, but as a defense of the traditional American family against radical cultural overreach. The border confession was the fatal mistake, but the culture war posturing was the final nail in his candidacy's coffin. Representative Jasmine Crockett escalated her critique by turning the focus inward, diagnosing Newsom's political style as a form of chameleonic betrayal that damaged the party's core message and risked alienating its diverse base. Her target was Newsom's perceived elitism and his willingness to sacrifice ideological consistency for expediency. Governor, you are praised as a chameleon for your ability to shift positions, Crockett stated, her tone shifting to profound disappointment. But the problem with a chameleon is you never know what color it truly is. You admit the Biden administration was paralyzed by reaction to Trump, yet your entire career is now defined by your own reaction to progressive trends, embracing them loudly only to abandon the messaging when it becomes politically inconvenient. Crockett highlighted the political theatrics that undercut his credibility, citing the cringeworthy, deep-fake video Newsom posted of Trump's arrest. That was not effective campaigning. That was the childish attempt of a politician trying to prove he's hip to the social media left. All while he's busy admitting on Ezra Klein that the party's security strategy was a failure. She argued that this style of leadership, petty, reactive, and ideologically inconsistent, was toxic for the party's diverse coalition. Our base, governor, needs certainty. They need a leader who won't admit that our security policy was based on vengeance against Donald Trump. They need a leader who won't fund their policies with the money of the very people we claim to be fighting. Crockett pointed to the internal danger of supporting a candidate whose vulnerabilities were so profound. You look like the favorite in the betting markets, but you are a political liability in the general election. You are a gift to J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. The Republican Party doesn't need to lift a finger. They just need to play back your interviews. The underlying fear in the caucus was palpable. That Newsom was a fatally flawed nominee who would lead the party to a devastating loss in 2028. Crockett summarized the core strategic error. You provided the opposition with the two elements they needed to win: the admission of security failure and the evidence of cultural extremism. You are giving the next election on a silver platter, but you are forcing the Democratic Party to be the one holding the platter. She demanded immediate clarity on his intentions. Are you committed to this party's messaging? Or are you going to continue passing laws that you yourself admitted are political losers, only to pivot and condemn our national security failures on national television? We need a leader, governor, not an actor. The session was rapidly devolving, leaving Newsom utterly exposed to the internal fury of his own party, who viewed his ambition as a direct threat to their collective future. Representative Jasmine Crockett steered the discussion toward the path forward, using Governor Gavin Newsom's confession as the basis for a complete overhaul of the Democratic approach to immigration and security. Her goal was to force the party to shed its ideological denial and govern from a position of pragmatic strength. Governor, your central concession, that the Biden administration ultimately proved Trump right by using executive authority to stem the border crossings, is the most crucial piece of data we have. Crockett asserted, it means we must stop fighting the method and start fighting for a legislative solution that works, rather than continuing the 180-degree spite. Crockett argued that the initial policy paralysis was the true national tragedy. The party's refusal to acknowledge the scale of the mass migration crisis, coupled with the political motive to dismantle every Trump-era policy, led to unnecessary chaos and forced the executive branch into reactive, unilateral action. "We paid a huge price," Crockett lamented, quoting Newsom's own words. "We learned the wrong lessons in the midterms. Instead of focusing on getting the border right, we focused on ideological purity and fighting cultural battles that nobody outside of our coastal strongholds cares about." She demanded that Newsom and the party leadership publicly acknowledge the necessity of strong, immediate border enforcement measures. "We need to stop using the border as a political weapon and start using it as a national security responsibility. We must admit that sanctuary policies cannot coexist with uncontrolled mass migration, especially when they impose massive, unfunded federal subsidies onto the rest of the nation." Crockett's ultimate challenge was ideological. The party needed to move past its fear of appearing Trump-like and embrace effective governance. "We cannot fix the comprehensive immigration problem until we fix the border problem. And we cannot fix the border problem until we stop acting out of spite. Your confession, Governor, is the first step toward correcting the fundamental error of our last 4 years." The session concluded with the realization that Newsom's self-incrimination, while damaging his personal ambition, had inadvertently provided the most powerful leverage for the pragmatic wing of the party. The crisis had become too severe, and the opposition too effective, to continue the strategy of ideological denial. The Democratic Party was forced to look directly at the man who had just admitted their core failures and decide whether they would double down on the contradiction or embrace the uncomfortable truth he had publicly revealed. The 2026 midterms would be the direct test of whether the party could learn the right lessons from the failure that Newsom had so eloquently detailed. The closed-door caucus meeting ended not with a consensus, but with the profound realization that Governor Gavin Newsom's presidential bid had been crippled by his own honesty. Representative Jasmine Crockett delivered the closing statement, cementing the political damage he had inflicted on the party's future. "Governor, you came here as the undisputed frontrunner for 2028, Crockett began, her voice conveying a sense of finality. "You leave having provided the opposition with the complete, self-admitted blueprint for our defeat." She summarized the fatal contradictions, listing them as the core components of the opposition's campaign strategy. Security betrayal. Confessed that the border chaos was caused by the party's own 180-degree spite against Donald Trump. Fiscal fraud. Confirmed that California's moral healthcare policy was a federally subsidized mandate, validating the charge of taxpayer abuse. Cultural extremism. Boasted of championing polarizing issues that he himself admitted 80% of the public rejects. Strategic error. Admitted the party focused on the wrong lessons in the midterms, ignoring the national security crisis. "The opposition does not need to manufacture a lie about you, Governor," Crockett asserted. "They simply need to play back your own voice confirming that you are a leader who prioritizes ideological vengeance over national security and personal emotion over political reality." Crockett then delivered the most stinging critique of all, focusing on the lack of depth within the Democratic bench. "Your high polling numbers are not a sign of your strength, but a sign of our weakness. The fact that the man who just confessed to engineering the security failure and confirming the financial fraud is still our favorite tells the American people everything they need to know about the choices we are offering." The result was a profound internal crisis. Newsom's candidacy was now a political paradox. He was too damaged to win the general election, yet too powerful to be easily defeated in the primary. The party was facing a fractured path to 2028. Paralyzed by the man who had the courage to tell the truth about their collective failure but lacked the political wisdom to keep that truth private. The final verdict was delivered not by the committee, but by the undeniable evidence of the transcript. Newsom's attempt at sophisticated pragmatism, being honest about the failure to gain credibility, had backfired catastrophically. He proved that in the realm of high-stakes politics, the most dangerous gaffe is telling the enemy exactly how and why you failed.